Now carefully consider all of the evidence, decide who and what to believe, and decide whether the prosecution has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. Ricci is guilty of the crimes charged in this case. As I said, the final steps in this trial will take place in 3 different steps. First, I am going to give you the instructions now about the law that is specific to the charges in this case. After I do that, the attorneys will make their closing arguments, where they will highlight the evidence that they think is important and will argue in favor of the conclusions they ask you to reach. The defense will argue first, and the prosecution will argue last. After the closing arguments, I will give you more generalized instructions and will help guide you through your evaluation of the evidence and your decision-making and deliberations in this case. You will then work together to reach a verdict. Please pay careful attention to my instructions. All of my instructions are important, and you must follow all of them, even if you do not agree with them. To make sure that I give these instructions accurately, as you know, I am largely reading these instructions. That's deliberate. You will also get a written copy to refer to in the jury room during your deliberations. Due to the length of the charge, I'll be sending in a copy for each of you to use while you deliberate the case. I'm going to do my best to make sure that the instructions that I give you now orally match with those written instructions. If there is anything different between what I say aloud and what is in the written instructions, please follow my oral instructions now. Let me start with the prosecution's burden of proof and the presumption of innocence. There is a fundamental rule that applies in every criminal case, including this case. Every person who is accused of a crime is presumed to be innocent of that crime. Ms. Ricci is presumed innocent of the charges in this case. That means you must consider Ms. Ricci to be innocent unless the prosecution has proved beyond a reasonable doubt through evidence presented at the trial that Ms. Ricci committed the crimes charged. And I will explain what I mean by reasonable doubt in a moment. Ms. Ricci does not have to do anything to convince you she is innocent. She does not have to explain anything. Ms. Ricci does not have to testify, call or question witnesses, or provide any evidence at all because you must presume she is innocent. Instead, it is up to the Commonwealth to prove the charges against Ms. Ricci beyond a reasonable doubt. This burden of proof never shifts to the defendant. After you have considered all the evidence carefully and fairly, if you have a reasonable doubt about Ms. Ricci's guilt on a particular charge, then your verdict should be not guilty on that charge. You may find Ms. Ricci guilty of a charge only if all 12 deliberating jurors agree that the Commonwealth has proved the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. So, the burden is on the Commonwealth to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. Ricci is guilty of the charges made against her. What is proof beyond a reasonable doubt? The term is often used and probably pretty well understood, though it's not easily defined. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean proof beyond all possible doubt, for everything in the lives of human beings is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. A charge is proved beyond a reasonable doubt if, after you've compared and considered all of the evidence, you have in your minds an abiding conviction to a moral certainty that the charge is true. When we refer to moral certainty, we refer to the highest degree of certainty possible in matters relating to human affairs, based solely on the evidence that has been put before you in this case. I've told you that every person is presumed to be innocent until he or she is proved guilty, and that the burden of proof is on the prosecution. If you evaluate the evidence and you still have a reasonable doubt remaining, the defendant is entitled to the benefit of that doubt and must be acquitted. It is not enough for the Commonwealth to establish a probability, even a strong probability, that the defendant is more likely to be guilty than not guilty. That is not enough. Instead, the evidence must convince you of the defendant's guilt to a reasonable and moral certainty, a certainty that convinces your understanding and satisfies your reason and judgment as jurors who are sworn to act conscientiously on the evidence. That is what I mean by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's now discuss what the prosecution must prove. There are 2 indictments or charges in this case, and you must decide whether Ms. Ricci is guilty of those charges. For each of the charges, there are certain things, we call them elements, that the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt to show that Ms. Ricci is guilty, and I will explain these legal rules to you now. First, indictment 001, charges murder. There are 2 different degrees of murder, murder in the first degree and murder in the second degree. If you find the defendant guilty of murder, you shall decide the degree of murder. The Commonwealth alleges that the defendant committed murder in the first degree on 2 theories. First, murder with deliberate premeditation, and second, murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty. To find the defendant guilty on either of these theories of murder, you must be unanimous. That is, all the deliberating jurors must agree that the Commonwealth has met its burden of proving every required element on that theory beyond a reasonable doubt. You should check the appropriate box or boxes on the verdict slip as to each theory on which you agree unanimously. If you are unable to agree unanimously that the Commonwealth has met its burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt on either of these theories of first-degree murder, you shall consider whether the Commonwealth has proved the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of murder in the second degree. If you are unable to agree unanimously that the Commonwealth has met its burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree or murder in the second degree, you shall consider whether the Commonwealth has proved the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the lesser offenses of voluntary manslaughter or involuntary manslaughter. And I'll begin on instructing you on the elements and the additional requirements of proof for each of these theories of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. I will next instruct you on the second theory of murder in the first degree. I will next instruct you on murder in the second degree. I will then instruct you on voluntary manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter. Finally, I will instruct you on indictment 002, the charge of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. And then I will review the verdict slips with you. Let me start first with murder with deliberate premeditation. To prove the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt the following four elements. First, that the defendant caused the death of Michael Ricci Sr. Second, that the defendant intended to kill Michael Ricci Sr. That is, the defendant consciously and purposefully intended to cause Michael Ricci Sr.'s death. Third, that the defendant committed the killing with deliberate premeditation. That is, she decided to kill after a period of reflection. And fourth, in addition to these elements, the Commonwealth must prove that there were no mitigating circumstances. I will now discuss each of these requirements in more detail. As to the first element is that the defendant caused the death of Michael Ricci Sr. A defendant's act is the cause of death, where the act is in a natural and continuous sequence results in death, and without which death would not have occurred. The second element is that the defendant intended to kill Michael Ricci Sr. That is, the defendant consciously and purposefully intended to cause Michael Ricci Sr.'s death. If you have a reasonable doubt as to whether Michael Ricci Sr.'s death was accidental because the death was caused by a negligent, careless, or mistaken act of the defendant, or resulted from a cause separate from the defendant's conduct, you may not find that the Commonwealth has proved this element of intent to kill the victim. The third element is that the defendant committed the killing with deliberate premeditation. That is, she decided to kill after a period of reflection. Deliberate premeditation does not require any particular length of time of reflection. A decision to kill may be formed over a period of days, hours, or even a few seconds. The key is the sequence of the thought process. First, the consideration whether to kill. Second, the decision to kill. And third, the killing arising from the decision. There is no deliberate premeditation where the action is taken so quickly that a defendant takes no time to reflect on the action and then decides to do it. In deciding whether the defendant intended to kill Michael Ricci Sr. and whether she formed that intent with deliberate premeditation, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment. A defendant may form the required intent and act with deliberate premeditation even if she suffered from a mental impairment. But you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved this element. The fourth element of the charge of first-degree murder on a theory of deliberate premeditation is that the Commonwealth is required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there were no mitigating circumstances. The law recognizes that in certain circumstances, which we refer to as mitigating circumstances, the crime is a lesser offense than it would have been in the absence of the mitigating circumstance. A killing that would otherwise be murder in the first or second degree is reduced to the lesser offense of voluntary manslaughter if the defendant killed someone under mitigating circumstances. Not every circumstance you may think to be mitigating is recognized as mitigating under the law. In this case, the mitigating circumstances that you must consider are heat of passion on reasonable provocation and heat of passion induced by sudden combat. To prove that the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there were no mitigating circumstances. And I will instruct you on each of these mitigating circumstances in more detail later when I discuss voluntary manslaughter. Moving next on to the second theory of first-degree murder, murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty. You shall consider this theory of murder in the first degree regardless of whether or not you find the Commonwealth has proved murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. To prove the defendant guilty of murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty, the Commonwealth must prove the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant caused the death of Michael Ricci Sr. Second, that the defendant either A, intended to kill Michael Ricci Sr., or B, intended to cause grievous bodily harm to Michael Ricci Sr., or C, intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. The third element under this theory is that the killing was committed with extreme atrocity or cruelty. In addition, the fourth element is, in addition to the first three elements, the Commonwealth must also prove that there were no mitigating circumstances. And I'll discuss each of these requirements now in more detail. The first element is that the defendant caused the death of Michael Ricci, Sr. The defendant's act is the cause of death, where the act, in a natural and continuous sequence, results in death, and without which death would not have occurred. The second element is that the defendant, as I said, A, intended to kill Michael Ricci, Sr., or B, intended to cause grievous bodily harm to Michael Ricci, Sr., or C, intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would occur. As you can see, the second element has three sub-elements, which I will call prongs. And the Commonwealth satisfies its burden of proof if it proves any one of the three prongs beyond a reasonable doubt. The first prong, the defendant intended to kill, is the same as the second element of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. The second and third prongs are different from any element of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. Moving to that second prong under this theory, the second prong is that the defendant intended to cause grievous bodily harm to Michael Ricci, Sr. Grievous bodily harm means severe injury to the body. The third prong is that the defendant intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. Let me help you understand how to analyze this third prong. You must first determine whether the defendant intended to perform the act that caused the victim's death. If you find that she intended to perform the act, you must then determine what the defendant herself actually knew about the relevant circumstances at the time she acted. Then you must determine whether, under the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known that the act intended by the defendant created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. If you have a reasonable doubt as to whether the victim's death was accidental, because the death was caused by a negligent, careless, or mistaken act of the defendant, or resulted from a cause separate from the defendant's conduct, you may not find that the Commonwealth has proved that the defendant intended to kill, intended to cause grievous bodily harm, or intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. In deciding whether the defendant intended to kill, intended to cause grievous bodily harm, or intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment. The third element is that the killing was committed with extreme atrocity or cruelty. Extreme atrocity means an act that is extremely wicked or brutal, appalling, horrifying, or utterly revolting. Extreme cruelty means that the defendant caused the person's death by a method that surpassed the cruelty inherent in any taking of a human life. You must determine whether the method or mode of a killing is so shocking as to amount to murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty. The inquiry focuses on the defendant's actions in terms of the manner and means of inflicting death, and on the resulting effect on the victim. In deciding whether the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant caused the death of the deceased with extreme atrocity or cruelty, you must consider the following three factors. First, whether the defendant was indifferent to or took pleasure in the suffering of the deceased. Second, whether the defendant's method or means of killing the deceased was reasonably likely to substantially increase or prolong the conscious suffering of the victim. Or three, whether the means used by the defendant were excessive and out of proportion to what would be needed to kill a person. In considering whether the means used by the defendant were excessive and out of proportion to what would be needed to kill a person, you may consider A, the extent of the injuries to the deceased, B, the number of blows delivered, C, the manner, degree, and severity of the force used, and D, the nature of the weapon, instrument, or method used. You cannot make a finding of extreme atrocity or cruelty unless it is based on one or more of the three factors I just listed. A murder committed by a single blow may be extremely cruel or atrocious, where there is evidence of one or more of these three factors. You may consider the defendant's mental condition at the time of the killing, including any credible evidence of mental impairment, in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the killing with extreme atrocity or cruelty. In addition to these elements, the Commonwealth must also prove that there were no mitigating circumstances. And I have already mentioned that I will instruct you on mitigating circumstances later when I discuss voluntary manslaughter. Now I will turn to murder in the second degree. In order to prove murder in the second degree, the Commonwealth must prove the following elements. First, that the defendant caused the death of Michael Ricci, Sr. Second, that the defendant A, intended to kill Michael Ricci, Sr., or B, intended to cause grievous bodily harm to Michael Ricci, Sr., or C, intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known, created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. Third, in addition to these first two elements, Commonwealth must also prove that there are no mitigating circumstances. If the Commonwealth proves all of the required elements, but fails to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there are no mitigating circumstances, you must find the defendant not guilty of murder, but then you shall return a verdict of voluntary manslaughter. The requirements of proof for murder in the second degree are the same as the elements for murder in the first degree with extreme atrocity and cruelty, but without the element that the killing was committed with extreme atrocity or cruelty. Moving now to voluntary manslaughter. To prove the defendant guilty of murder in the first or second degree, the Commonwealth is required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there were no mitigating circumstances that reduced the defendant's culpability. A mitigating circumstance is a circumstance that reduces the seriousness of the offense in the eyes of the law. A killing that would otherwise be a murder in the first or second degree is reduced to the lesser offense of voluntary manslaughter where the Commonwealth has failed to prove that there were no mitigating circumstances. Therefore, if the Commonwealth proves all of the required elements of murder, but fails to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there were no mitigating circumstances, you must not find the defendant guilty of murder, but you shall find the defendant guilty of voluntary manslaughter. I will now instruct you on each of these mitigating circumstances. Let me pause to get some water. The first mitigating circumstance is heat of passion on reasonable provocation. Heat of passion includes the states of mind of passion, anger, fear, fright, and nervous excitement. Reasonable provocation is provocation by the person killed that would be likely to produce such a state of passion, anger, fear, fright, or nervous excitement in a reasonable person as would overwhelm his or her capacity for reflection or restraint, and did actually produce such a state of mind in the defendant. The provocation must be such that a reasonable person would have become incapable of reflection or restraint and would not have cooled off by the time of the killing, and that the defendant herself was so provoked and did not cool off at the time of the killing. In addition, there must be a causal connection between the provocation, the heat of passion, and killing. The killing must occur after the provocation and before there is sufficient time for the emotion to cool, and must be the result of the state of mind induced by the provocation, rather than by a pre-existing intent to kill or grievously injure, or an intent to kill formed after the capacity for reflection or restraint is returned. Mere words, no matter how insulting or abusive, do not ordinarily by themselves constitute reasonable provocation. Reasonable provocation does not require physical contact, but physical contact, even a single blow, may amount to reasonable provocation. Whether the contact is sufficient will depend on whether a reasonable person, under similar circumstances, would have been provoked to act out of emotion rather than reasoned reflection, and on whether the defendant was, in fact, so provoked. The heat of passion must also be sudden. That is, the killing must have occurred before a reasonable person would have regained control of his or her emotions, and the defendant must have acted in the heat of passion before she regained control of her emotions. If the Commonwealth has not proved beyond a reasonable doubt the absence of heat of passion on reasonable provocation, the Commonwealth has not proved that the defendant committed the crime of murder. Next, I want to talk about heat of passion induced by sudden combat. Sudden combat involves a sudden assault by the person killed and the defendant upon each other. In sudden combat, physical contact, even a single blow, may amount to reasonable provocation. Whether the contact is sufficient will depend on whether a reasonable person under similar circumstances would have been provoked to act out of emotion rather than reasoned reflection, and on whether the defendant was in fact so provoked. The heat of passion induced by sudden combat must also be sudden. That is, the killing must have occurred before a reasonable person would have regained control of his or her emotions, and the defendant must have acted in the heat of passion without cooling off at the time of the killing. If the Commonwealth has not proved beyond a reasonable doubt the absence of heat of passion induced by sudden combat, the Commonwealth has not proved the defendant committed the crime of murder. In summary, a killing that would otherwise be murder is reduced to the lesser offense of voluntary manslaughter if the defendant kills someone because of heat of passion on reasonable provocation or heat of passion induced by sudden combat. The Commonwealth has the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant did not kill as a result of heat of passion on reasonable provocation or heat of passion induced by sudden combat. If the Commonwealth fails to meet this burden, the defendant is not guilty of murder, but you shall find the defendant guilty of voluntary manslaughter if the Commonwealth has proved the other required elements. Let me next move to involuntary manslaughter. Involuntary manslaughter is the unlawful killing unintentionally caused by wanton or reckless conduct. Wanton or reckless conduct is intentional conduct that created a high degree of likelihood that substantial harm will result to another person. Wanton or reckless conduct usually involves an affirmative act. An omission or failure to act may constitute wanton or reckless conduct where the defendant has a duty to act. To prove that the defendant is guilty of involuntary manslaughter because of wanton or reckless conduct, the Commonwealth must prove the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant caused Michael Ricci Sr.'s death. Second, that the defendant intended the conduct that caused Michael Ricci Sr.'s death. And third, that the defendant's conduct was wanton or reckless. I'll now discuss each of these elements in more detail. The first element is that the defendant caused the death of Michael Ricci Sr. As stated earlier, a defendant's act is the cause of death, where the act, in a natural and continuous sequence, results in death, and without which death would not have occurred. The second element is that the defendant intended the conduct that caused the death. The Commonwealth is not required to prove that the defendant intended to cause death. The third element is that the defendant's conduct was wanton or reckless. Wanton or reckless conduct is conduct that creates a high degree of likelihood that substantial harm will result to another. It is a conduct involving a grave risk of harm to another person, undertaken with indifference to or disregard of the consequences of such conduct. Whether conduct is wanton or reckless depends either on what the defendant knew or how a reasonable person would have acted knowing what the defendant knew. If the defendant realized the grave risk created by her conduct, her subsequent act amounts to what wanton or reckless conduct, whether or not a reasonable person would have realized the risk of grave danger. Even if the defendant herself did not realize the grave risk of harm to another, the act would constitute wanton or reckless conduct if a reasonable person, knowing what the defendant knew, would have realized the act posed a risk of grave danger to another. It's not enough for the Commonwealth to prove the defendant acted negligently, that is, in a manner that a reasonably careful person would not act. The Commonwealth must prove that the defendant's actions went beyond negligence and amounted to wanton or reckless conduct, as I defined that term. In deciding whether the defendant knew or should have known her conduct created a high degree of likelihood that substantial harm would result to another, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment. A defendant may have the requisite knowledge, even if she suffered from a mental impairment, but you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved this element. I'm now going to give you supplemental instructions on indictment, the charge of indictment 001. First, definition of death. Death occurs when the heart has stopped long enough to result in complete and permanent loss of brain function. This complete and permanent loss of brain function occurs when, in the opinion of a licensed physician based on ordinary and accepted standards of medical practice, there has been a total and irreversible cessation of spontaneous brain functions, and further attempts at resuscitation or continued supportive maintenance would not be successful in restoring such functions. Next, use of a dangerous weapon. As a general rule, you are permitted, but not required, to infer that a person who intentionally uses a dangerous weapon on another person intends to kill that person or cause him grievous bodily harm, or intends to do an act which, in the circumstances known to her or him, a reasonable person would know creates a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. The third supplemental instruction regards your obligation on guilt or innocence. If the evidence convinces you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of a criminal offense, you have a duty to find the defendant guilty of the most serious offense that the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt. If the evidence does not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of any offense charged, you must find her not guilty. Moving now to indictment 002, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. In indictment 02, the defendant is charged with assault and battery on Michael Ricci Sr. by means of a dangerous weapon on January 28, 2021. The Commonwealth may prove a person guilty of assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon based on two theories, intentional or reckless conduct. I'll first instruct you on intentional assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. To prove Christine Ricci guilty of intentional assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon, the Commonwealth must prove 4 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant touched Michael Ricci Sr. Second, that the defendant did so by means of a dangerous weapon. Third, that the defendant intended to touch Michael Ricci Sr. And fourth, the touching was not justified. As to the first element, the Commonwealth must prove that the defendant touched Michael Ricci Sr. A touching is any physical contact, however slight. Second, the Commonwealth must prove that the defendant touched Michael Ricci Sr. by means of a dangerous weapon. A dangerous weapon is any object that is, by its design or how it is used, can cause serious bodily injury or death. For instance, an object such as a gun, dagger, sword, or the like is a dangerous weapon based on its design purpose to cause serious bodily injury or death. Another object, such as a pocket knife, baseball bat, shoe, or even pencil, that is not designed to cause injury or harm becomes a dangerous weapon if a person uses it to cut, strike, or otherwise touch someone in a way that a reasonable person would recognize could cause serious bodily injury or death. The third element, intended to touch, requires you to consider the defendant's state of mind. A person intends to touch if the person means to touch, as opposed to doing it accidentally or carelessly. The Commonwealth does not have to prove that Christine Ricci intended to harm Michael Ricci Sr., but the Commonwealth must prove that the defendant meant to touch Michael Ricci Sr. with a dangerous weapon. If you have a reasonable doubt as to whether the touching of Michael Ricci Sr. was accidental, because the touching was caused by a negligent, careless, or mistaken act of the defendant, or resulted from a cause separate from the defendant's conduct, you may not find the Commonwealth has proved this element of intent to touch Michael Ricci Sr. As to the fourth element, the law accepts certain touchings as justified, even if done with potentially dangerous weapons. For example, when a doctor performs a surgery or when a person consents to expected contact by playing certain sports, the Commonwealth must prove the touching was not justified. The second theory of assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon is reckless assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. To prove the defendant guilty of assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon by reckless conduct, the Commonwealth must prove four elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant acted recklessly. Second, that the defendant intended to do the act. Third, that the defendant's reckless act caused Michael Ricci Sr.'s bodily injury. And fourth, the bodily injury was done by means of a dangerous weapon. As to the first element, the Commonwealth must prove that the defendant acted recklessly. A person who acts recklessly does something even though she knows or should have known that her action is very likely to cause substantial bodily injury to another person. It is not enough for the Commonwealth to prove that Ms. Ricci was careless or negligent, or that she did not act reasonably. The Commonwealth must prove that Ms. Ricci recognized, or a reasonable person in her position would have recognized, that her actions were so dangerous that they were very likely to cause substantial bodily injury to someone else. But Ms. Ricci nonetheless went ahead anyway. The Commonwealth does not have to prove that the defendant intended to strike or hurt anyone, or that she expected anyone would be hurt. As to the second element, the Commonwealth must prove that Ms. Ricci conscientiously decided to do the act and that she did not do it accidentally. I refer you to my earlier instruction above as to the definition of accidental, which I gave you in the first instruction on assault and battery, dangerous weapon, intentional. The Commonwealth does not have to prove that Ms. Ricci intended to injure or touch Michael Ricci Sr. As to the third element, the Commonwealth must prove that Christine Ricci's reckless act caused Michael Ricci Sr. bodily injury. Bodily injury is injury that is serious enough to hurt Michael Ricci Sr. or interfere with Michael Ricci Sr.'s health or physical welfare. Bodily injury is something that does more than just shake Michael Ricci Sr. up or cause Michael Ricci Sr. minor discomfort. It must be more serious than that, but it does not have to cause permanent injury. As to the fourth element, the Commonwealth must prove that the bodily injury was done by means of a dangerous weapon. I refer you to the definition of dangerous weapon that I previously gave to you under the theory of intentional assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. The Commonwealth must prove that the bodily injury was done by Ms. Ricci using a dangerous weapon, causing a dangerous weapon to come in contact with Michael Ricci Sr., or causing Michael Ricci Sr. to come into contact with a dangerous weapon. So jurors, I'm going to ask you to please stand up and stretch. Does anyone need a bathroom break? I'll move to the closing argument. Again, let me know. I see all negatives. You let me know if you do. Please be seated when you're comfortable. So, jurors, this concludes my first set of instructions to you, the instructions specific to the charges in this case. And we will now hear the closing arguments of counsel. This is an important part of the trial because it's the final opportunity given to the lawyers to address you. It is an opportunity for the lawyers to summarize the evidence, to call your attention to certain parts of the evidence that they regard as important, and, based on the evidence, to try to persuade you to reach a certain result. However, what you are about to hear is not evidence. The lawyers are not witnesses. All of the evidence in this case has been presented through the testimony of the witnesses at this witness stand and the exhibits which you will have an opportunity to examine and consider during your deliberations. Our rules are designed to ensure that the parties receive a fair trial, and that they therefore prohibit the attorneys from making certain types of arguments in an effort to persuade you to reach a certain result or to favor or discredit either party. For example, the attorneys are not permitted to refer to facts that are not in evidence in this case. If, based on your memory and understanding of the evidence, a lawyer does this, you should disregard that comment. The attorneys are not permitted to express their personal beliefs in the credibility or lack of credibility of any witness who testified in this case. That determination, credibility, is entirely for you to make. If a lawyer makes such a comment with regard to the credibility or lack of credibility of any witness, you should disregard that point. This case must be decided solely on the basis of the admissible evidence and the law that I give to you. Attorneys are not permitted to persuade you for or against either party by appealing to human passions, emotions, or prejudices. If a lawyer makes such a comment, you should disregard that comment. If you become conscious of any passion or prejudice as you consider the evidence and engage in your deliberations, you must put those feelings aside and not permit them to influence your thinking. And with that, we will turn to the closing arguments of counsel. We'll hear first from the defense, as is the custom. Attorney Wolf. Yes?
The Commonwealth never proved in this case that Christine Ricci intended to kill her husband. Admittedly, though, in order to see that clearly and extract that truth, we need to dig through and sift the mountain of dirt they were allowed to come in and dump on Christine Ricci in this case. We need to look through it, sift it, and categorize it, and put it in bins so that we understand what it is. And once we understand what it is, we can deal with it, we can clear it away, and we can start talking about what happened on January 28, 2021. So let's start by talking about all that dirt, and then I'll get into the events of January 28, which are the critical period of time that this entire case is about. As I told you, every answer to every question that we have is talking about the even period on that night. But before we get there, we need to talk about the stuff that they spent most of the case talking about. Amongst the dirt that they piled up in this courtroom, I think you can sort of separate it into essentially four bins. There's the bruise stories that you heard about. There's the suicide attempts. There's the implication that there was some controlling behavior on the part of Christine relative to Michael. And there was all the stuff about Janine Bouchard. And I'll talk about each one of them in turn because I think it's important to get and figure out exactly what's being said and what was exactly presented to you. In the first bin, we talk about bruise stories. And what are they? Basically, we had 5 people testify about bruising. But just because 5 people testified about bruising doesn't mean that there were 5 bruises. What do we know? Sophia was the first person to testify, and she said that sometime about 2 years before her father's death, which would have been the beginning of 2019, she heard that an argument had occurred, and then shortly afterwards saw a bruise on the side of her father's face, near his eye, and a fat lip. Katrina Freeman came in and testified, and she said she remembers an incident in which the parties were fighting. And during the fighting, the parties went outside. And shortly afterwards, she saw Christine come back inside the house complaining about her hand. And when asked how she hurt her hand, she said, I hit it in the face, and that's how I hurt my hand. She also testified in cross-examination that afterwards, Ms. Ricci was wearing a cast for a period of several weeks, and that Michael Ricci, when she saw him the next day, had a bruise on the side of his face, near his eye, and a fat lip. Michael Ricci Jr. testified that he, when he was still living in the house, which we know was before June of 2019, was in his bedroom looking outside the window when he observed his parents leave the house and continue an argument that had happened starting outside. And as he's doing that house, he sees Ms. Ricci strike Big Michael. So essentially we have an event that occurs either at the end of 2018 or 2019. It happens outside the house. That's consistent with both Katrina's version of the event as well as Michael Jr.'s version of the event. We have bruising in the very same area, in the area by the eye and a fat lip. Then we have the testimony from Mark McDonald. Now, there's a few things that we learned from Mark McDonald. One is that he's no good at timeouts. But there's a few things that we know about when he would have made his observations. And we have that information as a result and as a benefit from little Michael's testimony. And the testimony is this. We know that Max says Michael's work with his company, MCC, began to taper off after he had a conversation with Big Michael about Michael's plans to leave his marriage. We know from other testimonies that that was in October of 2018. And we know that the tapering down of the work started then. And we know that Michael Jr. started working for MCC starting at the beginning of 2019, and by then, Big Michael was no longer working for him. We know that Mr. McDonald's observations occurred during a period of time in which Michael Sr. was working for him. That puts the timing sometime at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. So what does he see? Well, he said a lot of things, but basically what he said was he saw bruising, fat lip, and then he mentioned some involvement about the nose. Now, you can decide whether or not Mark McDonald was trying to guilt or bully with some of those observations. It's not consistent with the people who were living in the house with Michael Sr. at the time, who just noticed the bruising. But all of those puzzle pieces fit together. They all take place in the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And they involve a fight that starts in the house and goes outside, and there's a hitting event. That is the same event. Katrina's saying that she sees the party, or she hears the parties leave the house. That puzzle piece fits perfectly with Michael Jr.'s observations from his bedroom window of the fight that is coming from the inside to the outside in the hitting event. What about Mac? We haven't heard from Michael Dillon. He made sort of an interesting set of observations about bruising. Doesn't attribute the bruising to anything, but he does say that in one instance, which he places sometime in mid-2019, although he's thinking back without any sort of temporal landmarks, that he sees 2 black guys. And then he says, several months before Michael Sr.'s death, he sees 1 black guy. And then shortly before Michael Sr.'s death, he sees some scratches. But that doesn't make any sense given the observations of people that were living in the house with Michael at that time. You remember Katrina Friedman saying she saw one bruise during that time. She'd seen him pretty regularly. Her angel saying he would see him 3 or 4 times a week. Didn't see 2 black guys and 1 black guy. I'm not suggesting that Michael Dillon was lying or that he was wrong about all of it, but is it possible that perhaps he may have mixed the order of those 2 events? Now, remember, we heard from Angel that probably about a year before his dad's death, his dad got septum surgery. And as a result of that, there was some swelling around his nose and some blackening of both eyes. Is it possible that what Mike Dillon is remembering is 2 separate events, but in the opposite order? One that happens not in the middle of 2019, but closer to the beginning of 2019. This would have been a time when Michael was working for Michael Dillon. Could he have seen the very same bruises that were described by Katrina, Sophia, and Michael Jr. from that same fight outside the house that went from the inside to the outside, where Christine struck Michael, he got some swelling in his eye and a fat lip, and she broke her hand? And is it possible that that second event actually happened afterwards, maybe about a year before Michael's death, when he came in with 2 black guys? That would be consistent with all the other evidence you've heard in the case. And if it's true, it means you've heard an enormous amount of evidence about bruising that all relates back to this one period of time, right at the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019, in which they got into a fight. And no one is justifying hitting anybody. Christine didn't make the right choice when she did that, but it's multiply attested by several witnesses that it happened. But it happens in this one instance. Yes, there are some other. There is the testimony of Michael Jr. that in the week or so before his father's death, he went and spoke to his father, and although he never mentioned it before, as he's picturing him in his mind, he may have noticed under one of the bags of his eyes that there was something that looked like a bruise without any attribution. But it's funny, because he was working with Michael Dillon at that time. Michael Dillon doesn't mention black and blue a week before. He was living with Angel. Angel doesn't mention black and blue a week earlier. He was living with Sophia, who was seeing him almost daily when he wasn't working. And remember, he was home a lot. He only worked, 1 day on, then he had 2 days off, and he had 1 24-hour shift on, and then 4 days off. And although he may have done some side work here and there, it wasn't the same as when he was working for Mac, when he was working all the time in sprinkler installation. That's what the evidence was. So at this point, he's home a lot. She's seeing him a lot. Angel's seeing him when he's home. Katrina's seeing him a lot all the way through December of 2020 when she leaves the house. Then we have all the evidence of the second thing, the suicide attempts. You heard about that. In that vein, I count 3 events. There is, let's start with the last one, the Katrina Ricci testimony. She testified that on May 10th, 2020, there was a suicide attempt in which Christine grabbed a knife, held it to her wrist, in the combined living room dining area room of the house, right outside the bathroom in that room. That's one. Let's go back in time about a year before that to June 6, 2019. And I'm going to suggest that the evidence suggested that there were 2 suicide attempts on that day. We have testimony of Michael Ricci Jr. And what was his testimony? What were his observations? He said he's home. He said his mother was home. They were watching TV together. She went upstairs to take a nap, and shortly thereafter his father got home. His father asked, "Where's your mother?" He said upstairs, and the father went. Michael Sr. went upstairs. Shortly thereafter, Michael begins to feel the house shaking and hears loud voices, and he goes upstairs to confront the couple who were fighting. When he gets there, his mother's upset. She's crying. They seem to be talking about the affair. And she says the words, "Get out." Maybe Michael Jr., maybe Michael Sr. But Michael Sr. leaves and goes downstairs. At that point, Christine apparently closes the door, and they're having a yelling match between a closed door. At a certain point, Christine has had enough of this back and forth, and she walks out and goes downstairs, and she goes to the kitchen, and she grabs a knife. And the testimony of Michael Jr. was that she either grabs a knife from the magnet holding the knives or the block of knives. And she's holding the knife, he says, like this, with the blade out. He's within feet of her. He's within feet of her. He says within 3 feet. He's within essentially grabbing distance of Christine. When he sees her get the knife, his testimony is he immediately grabs her. She only gets 2 steps away from that block of knives before he stops her. And he puts her arms behind her back, and he restrains her, and he brings her over to a chair, and he sits her down, and she's crying, and she's upset, and she's saying, "Get off of me," and eventually she drops the knife. And when she drops the knife, she says these words, "Why won't they let me kill myself? Why won't they let me kill myself?" Shortly after that, Angel comes home. He gets a call. Maybe it's from Michael Jr., maybe it's from one of the parents, but he gets a call. He's at work. He gets a call or he gets a text. "Come home. There's been a big fight between the parents and Michael Jr." He comes home. And he's mad. He's pissed. He also has had enough of the turmoil about the affair and the fact that there's arguing now between the kids and the parents. When he gets home, he goes right up to the parents' room, which is where the 2 of them are. And they're both sitting on the floor. And in Michael Jr.'s story, just before he goes downstairs, Christine smashes the mirror. And what Angel's story is that when he walks in the room, the glass in the mirror is still on the ground. So the 2 stories match up practically completely. He says at that point, he gets into a yelling argument with his parents, and that sets his mother off, and she goes downstairs again. And this time she grabs a knife and she holds it to her stomach, almost like the way that he said, as if to poke herself, or the way the Japanese person would commit suicide. he creates an image of what he was talking about. And then he says, he restrains her, and his father takes the knife out of her hand. You heard the testimony of Lee Rivera about that very same incident. What does Lee Rivera say? Lee Rivera says, well, when we asked him about it, she said, I want to make sure I get this right. She says, maybe I'm better off dead. That was her description of those two events. So we have these three events that all take place. And don't forget, during Michael's story, after she says the words, why don't they let me kill myself? He walks upstairs behind her because he's so nervous that she might do something to herself. And then we have the third bin, which is the bin where we have all the information that the Commonwealth wants to put on about controlling behaviors. And what exactly are the controlling behaviors? The first part is she controlled his phone. What's the evidence of that? Well, the evidence is that Mark McDonald said that he wasn't available on his former number after he left his employ. But remember, the phone that he had was a company phone from MCC. And when he stopped working for MCC, he got a new phone. Just like when he stopped working for MCC, a little while later, he got a new truck. There doesn't seem to be anything particularly sinister about that. He got all new friends. Yeah, the testimony was that shortly after the affair was disclosed and the parties and everybody started to talk, Michael admitted that he was an alcoholic and started going to Alcoholics Anonymous. And it seems like he took it seriously. From the testimony of Bobby Higgins, who you saw, he was an enthusiastic participant in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's oftentimes hard for people who were alcoholics because their social lives revolve around drinking. And many of their friends, even if they don't have problems, they're easily able to slip back into the old grooves, the old behaviors. And so it's important, oftentimes when people are trying to get better, trying to get clean, that they start a new set of social habits, new set of social rituals, and even start hanging around with people that, in the words of Bobby Higgins, are on the same path as them. It makes things easy. Makes things easier. And what do we know about Michael Sr.'s life when he was drinking? Well, a lot of his social activities revolved around alcohol. Now, they try to minimize it, but you heard the testimony of both Sophia and Angel. They both had concerns way before he ever said he was an alcoholic. Talked about the fact that he would come home and polish off an 18-pack. And before that, he would oftentimes go to the bar and drink and get warmed up at BBC, across the street from MCC, or down the street from MCC. It seems like Michael certainly felt that he had a problem because he said he had a problem. He told people he was an alcoholic. He got involved with all the steps of a sponsor. He did commitments, which means you go to places and give a speech about the process of getting sober. So we got a whole group of friends, but that makes sense under the circumstances. You heard from Bobby Higgins that the house at 679 Lorraine Street became kind of a hangout for all people that were in the sober softball league and people at AA. So he wasn't being isolated. He was just fraternizing with a whole new group of people that were on the same path as he was. What's the other evidence? That she would go to AA meetings with him? Well, she didn't go to the men's group with him. She didn't write his commitment speech for him. But Bobby Higgins told you that the AA encourages people, encourages people to bring their family along. And Christine did Al-Anon, and even went to Al-Anon with Bobby. She asked questions because she wanted to understand the nature of the 12-step program. She bought books, and she went back to school, and according to Sophia and Angel, she did it with sort of the idea that she was supporting Michael. It seems to me a lot of the stories of control could also be understood as stories of support, depending on what your attitudes were about Christine. And a good way of understanding what witnesses' attitudes were about Christine, a good litmus test, is that alcoholism issue. Because when Michael got sober, there were people on board and there were people that weren't on board. Michael McDonald, that skepticism, wouldn't admit it on the stand. Then again, he wouldn't admit much of anything. He wouldn't admit that when you're watching another way God. His timeline kept moving from year to year. 6 months could be 2 months, depending on what he needed it to be at that moment. But Michael Jr. told you. He said, if I had any doubts when I left, he begrudgingly admitted after talking to Mac, that solidified it. And all the guys that he used to go hang around with also doubted it. They doubted that he was an alcoholic because, after all, according to Mac, he wasn't even a heavy drinker. All he drank was beer. He was the guy. Mac was the guy who drank scotch. And if Mac didn't have a problem, certainly Michael didn't. It was always invented. The final category is the obsession with the affair, or what they call the obsession with the affair. And there's no doubt about this sort of evidence that the affair absolutely devastated Christine. There's just no question about it. She was initially upset at the betrayal. It sounds like the fact that Michael may have been claiming that he didn't remember certain things, or maybe saying that he didn't remember things that he did remember, was making her doubt, and not knowing if her doubt was true or founded. She wanted to believe in him. She wanted to believe the story he was telling her. But then he would slip up and say something that didn't fit, and then she would get upset again because she would feel betrayed again. And this was a relationship with a lot of trust issues. All that stuff they talked about control, that's a relationship with trust issues. That's what happens after an affair very often. There's a lot of talk about trust, and when there's lies that come out over time, it makes it very difficult to heal because you don't even understand what it is that you're healing from. And it sounds like that's a lot of what Christine was going through. And I'm not going to argue that Christine did what all of the rest of us would do, where she reacted within an average way. She was absolutely devastated. But that devastation, after early 2019, turned into a focus on trying to figure out what was wrong with Michael. And yeah, there were many people in Michael's life who didn't believe there was anything wrong. They felt that Christine was just making it all up. But Michael was telling her things that made her think that she was something, that she didn't understand what was going on, and she was looking for answers. She was looking for answers in the classes she took, she was looking for answers at AA, she was looking for answers at Al-Anon, and she was looking for answers by asking questions. And yes, the people around it must have seemed like they were having the same fight over and over again, and it must have been incredibly frustrating and terrible to be around. How was it evidence that Christine Ricci was on multiple medications? You heard from Sophia that she had panic attacks. You heard that she had some sort of debilitating arthritis, where she would wear brakes. You heard all of this evidence that she was in counseling and therapy. There's no doubt that this affected Christine Ricci, this affair affected her, probably more than a completely psychologically healthy person. But the evidence of all that dirt that was presented actually does give you a clue of the direction in which that pain was directed. From about the middle of 2019, all the way through 2020, this was suicidal ideation. This was making her doubt herself, making her wonder whether she was crazy or whether or not what she was hearing from Michael was crazy. And that type of second guessing, constantly second guessing, led her to not doubt the very ground that she was walking on. And she went to Jean's house on 2 occasions. Once they had a long, hour-long conversation. It sounds like it started out emotional. It sounded like it ended with some type of reconciliation, or at least some type of acknowledgement and a hug and a statement of forgiveness. It sounded like most of what she did during that conversation was ask questions that she couldn't get answers to from Michael. Now, we heard from Janine, and obviously Janine plays sort of a, based off of the role that she plays in Christine and Michael's relationship, she may have had a motive to be somewhat self-protective. But what came out was, that first conversation ended at a place that was more or less calm, even if it was emotionally kind of all over the place to begin. There was one thing that she said, well, I made the statement to her that your marriage was almost over, and you had already moved on, and Christine agreed with me. Is that credible, given the evidence in the case that was said? Given all the evidence you've heard about just how incredibly devastating Christine Ricci was about this affair, that she would just been, oh, that's true. No. Or does that sound like some sort of self-serving statement of someone who's trying to minimize and mitigate their moral responsibility for something? She could tell the truth while still shading around the edges. Christine hadn't moved on. This marriage wasn't over. Everybody said it was a good marriage. They got along, they were affectionate, they slept in the same bed. This wasn't that kind of thing at all. And she certainly wasn't agreeing that this marriage was almost over, or practically over. But what did come out of the conversation with Janine is that the focus of this conversation was Christine's confusion. And probably most of us would have just stopped asking questions. Stop trying to understand. And it's probably the fact that Christine kept trying to hold on to what he was saying and trying to make sense of it that really did drive her to this extreme of pulling the seat and asking these questions and having this moment where she sat down and talked with her. It also appears that she had a conversation in March she went over to have a conversation in March of 2020. And that conversation really never happened. It was sort of aborted before it ever began. But during that conversation, there was evidence that she was emotional. Yeah, we can't get away from her. She was emotional about it. But what was the nature of the emotion? The emotion was frustration and sadness and depression and anger and incredible feelings of self-doubt, self-hatred, and suicide for that period between 2019 and 2020. But that's about Christine. That's about Christine. And that's what they want this case to be about. A famous English jurist once said that in a criminal case, in a very real sense, the trial isn't about the defendant. It's not the defendant that's on trial. It's the government that's on trial. Because in a very real sense, it's the government's evidence that's on trial in a criminal case. And the question for the jury is whether they presented enough. Was there enough? And our standard of proof, which is the highest standard of proof in the legal system, is that after looking at all this evidence, all you know are things about Christine Ricci, and you know nothing about Christine's intentions on January 28, 2021, or you don't know what happened, your job is easy. They haven't presented enough evidence. Not enough. If at the end of the evidence you feel like you maybe know what happened on the night of January 20th, based on what all was presented to you, your job is easy. They haven't presented enough. Even if you think it's probable or highly probable what you think might have happened, unless you are sure to a moral certainty, then the answer is easy. It's not enough. It's the government in a criminal case that's on trial. In fact, if there's even one reasonable alternative that fits the evidence, that is a story of innocence, then your job is to say not enough. The government hasn't proven enough. So let's talk about January 28 now, 2021, and talk about a very real possibility of what occurred that way. We know that the arguing may have been going on for some time. It was going on when Sophia got home from school at about 2 p.m. She went upstairs to her room and she was trying not to pay attention. She knew that the parties had been fighting and it sort of became comical at that point. So she just was sort of doing her own thing, not really paying much attention, when all of a sudden she hears banging. She hears banging and the movement of things. And then shortly thereafter, she hears her mother yell, "Call 911." And she comes downstairs and sees her father laying on his side in the living room dining room area. And she calls 911, and you heard the 911 call. You heard the emotion in her voice. You heard that her focus was on talking to the 911 operator and answering his questions. And she had partial information. And you can also, during that call, hear the emotions of Christine. You can hear her crying in the background. You can hear the wailing and the hyperventilating and the crying. And in fact, Christine is still in that position later when other people arrive at the scene. So what can we gather from that? We also know that on the night in question, what's been marked as exhibit number 8, the police find in that area there's a knife on the ground, right there. And that's right next to a step-up that's about 1 foot, based on the testimony of all of the witnesses who are familiar with the house. And that Michael's foot, when he was found by first responders, was on the bottom of the step right here, or I'm sorry, on the other side, here. Doesn't it make sense that this argument began to happen? And what do we know, based on the prior acts? She's suicidal. She goes to that drawer, and she grabs a knife. I'm going to suggest she grabs this knife right here. It's been marked as exhibit number 23. It was marked by forensics as 1-4. And she holds it to herself, as if maybe to her wrist, maybe to her neck. When Michael sees that during the argument, he gets upset, and he runs into that room from the living room dining room. And he tackles her. And as he's tackling her, she hits the ground. She still has that knife in her hand. As she's plunging that knife towards her own ribcage, just below the breast. And Michael's arms are around her. And that is the first stabbing. She might not at this point even know that she's stabbed him. But he knows. All of his adrenaline is going, and now he's focused. He gets up, and maybe he's not gentle with her at all, and it's understandable why he would be under those circumstances. He's got pain in his shoulder, and he realizes that this is an out-of-control situation. He gets control of that arm. He might grab her to do it. He rips the knife out of her hand and runs over to that drawer. And he grabs all the knives in the drawer. And he runs over to that dining room table, and he throws the knives into the box on top of the dining room table. And then he turns around to see what's going on. By this point, Christine has gotten up off the ground, and she's gone over to that drawer, and she's grabbed another knife, this time a steak knife. This knife right here. This time she's holding the knife to her body, and he goes over, and he starts, this time he doesn't make a mistake. The first time he grabs her arm first, controls the arm with the knife, and they start moving around with that knife. And as he tries to twist that arm to get that knife out, the two of them begin to turn with Christine's back right in that doorway, right in front of that step leading down into the combined living room and basement. And as she pulls away to get that knife back, the two of them stumble off that ledge onto the floor, and the knife is still between them. He falls in, right into the knife, penetrating the center of his chest, with such force that the soft tissues in Michael's body were compressed such that the knife wound was longer than the actual blade of the knife causing the wound. At this point, Christine is underneath Michael. The knife is between them, and Michael is on top of her. She is beside herself. She rolls him off of her onto his side, and she gets up, still holding that knife, and drops it, and turns and screams for Sophia to call 911. When 911 arrives, and the police arrive, first she talks to Chris Martin. She's so emotional that he doesn't even know really 100% what she's saying. He doesn't have a complete account of what she's saying. What he's able to get out of her is a statement about manic episode and collapse. The idea that this is some sort of a full statement of what happened is ridiculous. She's just been through an incredibly traumatic event. Martin described her as being emotional, heaving, hyperventilating, crying, weeping. There was no way that he could have gotten a complete story out of her. And did she think that part of that event, maybe the part where he was grabbing her to get that knife away from her, was rough and maybe considered in that moment her? She's just through a trauma. This whole event was an incredibly exciting, traumatic event. She's not she's an emotionally fragile person, and this has just happened. She may have an accurate memory of it, but she certainly has a complete memory of what has just happened. And she's trying to just say what she thinks is relevant through her tears. And Martin, thinking that he's coming to a totally different type of call, is trying to piece together what he's hearing. And he's doing the best he can. It's not his fault. But he only gets a couple things. It's not until later that they bring her into the kitchen. And they sit her down, and Sophia goes and gets her medication, that she begins to say a little bit more. That's why there's no blood report. He landed on top of her. The knife. up by the corner of her shoulder. That's where his blood was right there. And he was on the blade that night, found in his body. All the rest of the blood was bleeding internally for the evidence of it. And that's why she might not have even known exactly what happened at that point. There's no blood around. Maybe she herself hasn't looked at herself and done an assessment of what's going on at all. All she knows is this thing just happened and it was the result of this event, this struggle, which she conceptualized as him attacking her. And again, maybe there was some basis for that because in a moment of his absolute worry and frustration over the circumstance, he might not have been that gentle. And then she goes to the police station. And they take photographs of her. They're marked as exhibit number 17. And what you'll see in picture 17, you can't see it on this screen. When you look closer at the picture, what you'll see is a large scratch mark. It looks like what was referred to as an incised wound on Christine Ricci's neck. And when they took photographs of her hands, you notice there's some incised wounds here on her arms. And more close up. That event, which began with a suicide attempt and ended with a struggle for the knife, which led the two of them to tumble off that stair, was never intended to be a stabbing of Michael. It was never intentional. The stumble was an accident, and the fall that created the penetrating force to let that knife go into Michael's body was an accident. If the Commonwealth's evidence does not disprove that, they haven't given you enough. And if they haven't given you enough, the way we say not enough in a courtroom is not guilty. Christine Ricci never intended to kill Michael. She never intended to stab Michael. What happened was an incredible tragedy that was the result of everything that was going on in the home for the previous 2 years, but was very specific, a few minutes around, but that call for 911. And if the Commonwealth's evidence, both forensic as well as testimony, do not affirmatively disprove that story, you must find Christine Ricci not guilty. Thank you.
And for the Commonwealth, ADA Cousin.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the only way to put an end to Christine Ricci's pain, anger, jealousy, and rage that consumed her was to put an end to the very person who caused that pain. She did so by stabbing Michael Ricci intentionally in his heart and then stabbed him again in his back. Cut his back, and I suggest to you, he injured his hands trying to defend himself from that armed woman with a knife filled with rage. Ladies and gentlemen, part of your jobs is to look at the evidence, and what's in evidence is very different than what defense counsel just spent 15 minutes of your precious time speculating about. What is for not evidence? What's evidence is your memories of what those witnesses testified to. What's evidence, ladies and gentlemen, are these knives, text messages, scene videos, the state of affairs in the house, and Michael Ricci's injuries created by Christine Ricci. That's evidence, ladies and gentlemen. Speculation? That's not it. Part of your jobs, ladies and gentlemen, is not just to look at the evidence, remember, and it's your memories I govern, what the witnesses said under oath. But there's other things that I think you should consider. You should also consider, ladies and gentlemen, although we don't need to prove it, motive. What kind of motive? Well, motive for Christine Ricci to commit this crime. I suggest that's abundantly clear from the evidence. Her jealousy was her motive. What else? Motive for each and every witness under oath to take that witness stand and tell you what they did. And you're allowed to consider who they are, perhaps what their affinity is towards in terms of who they're trying to protect or who they're trying to defend. You're allowed to consider all of that, although we don't need to prove it, the motive for Christine to do what she did. What else can you consider? Not just motive, but opportunity. Did Christine Ricci have the opportunity, the ability to do this gruesome act? I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear that this is a woman who has tried to do this before. This is a woman whose knife of choice are the very knives that she used to kill her husband. Did she have the opportunity? I suggest that's abundantly clear. Something else that might be helpful for you to be considering, you'll hear this word a lot, is corroboration. Not just that somebody said something, but why else should you believe what they're saying to be true? That's corroboration, basically, in layman's terms. Why should you believe what Michael Ricci Jr. said? Well, part of that is to look to the other evidence, to see if what he said, for example, matches up. And perhaps if it matches up with other people's recounts of events, perhaps you could lend more credibility to that. That's corroboration, ladies and gentlemen. You heard a lot from many different people for a very long time. I don't need to remind you. But what I'm going to do right now is summarize the evidence. And again, the judge will inform you, and I'll tell you now, it's your memory, it's not my memory. But I'll do my best to summarize accurately, not speculating, what was said. You heard first from Sophia Ricci. Clearly a difficult time for her. Clearly, she still loves her father and her mother. That stands on trial for murder. What did she tell you, ladies and gentlemen? She told you that she had a happy childhood. And then everything changed in the fall of 2018, which is kind of a common theme amongst everyone in that home, and they're testifying. What else did she tell you? She told you that on January 28, 2021, she heard yelling. She got home from school around 2 o'clock, so in terms of a timeline, defense counsel has tried to establish that there's a 15-minute segment. There's been no proof of that, ladies and gentlemen. The only times, if I could remind you, that we know of, is that Sophia Ricci got home that day at 2 o'clock. We know that Michael Ricci went to Dunkin' Donuts at 2:20 because we have video footage of that. And then we know that upon him coming home, that's when Sophia Ricci heard yelling and banging, as you might recall. And then the next piece of timeline we know about is approximately 4:48 when 911 was called. That's your timeline, ladies and gentlemen. Need not speculate. That's your timeline, and we know this because it's in evidence. And what else did she say? She said she heard the banging, she heard the yelling, and her quote was, "I'm used to it." She's used to it because it happens all the time. You heard it from multiple witnesses in that home. It was a daily occurrence. And what was it always about? It was always about the affair. She was obsessed, I suggest to you. So Sophia was used to this. Nothing new here, but this differed on this one occasion because her mother yelled to her, "Sophia!" She runs down the stairs. "Call 911. Defense has tried to establish that maybe the defendant was so inconsolable and nobody can understand anything she said. Well, Sophia heard her call her name pretty clearly. Sophia then testified that she heard her mother tell her, "Call 911. And then the next thing she told her to do was go upstairs and get her cell phone. So this is a woman who defense wants you to perhaps believe through the evidence that was incomprehensible and you're unable to understand her. Maybe she told everyone about this stabbing, nobody heard her. Well, you heard from her own daughter that she heard her quite clearly on those 3 separate occasions. What else did Sophia tell you? That her mother did not tell her what had happened. Why is that important? Because it corroborates the fact that the defendant also didn't tell any of the first responders. So again, looking for corroboration, why believe the first responders? Look to Sophia. Why believe Sophia's account? Look to the first responders. That's corroboration. She also told you her parents were fighting weekly. She said 1 to 2 years before this event on January 28th, she did see a bruise on her father's face following an argument with her mother over the affair, I suggest to you. She recalls her mother would be repeatedly, again a common theme, repeatedly asking for details about the affair. And when he wouldn't remember or say he wouldn't remember the details, she would get upset. And her quote was, she needed to know the details. Again, I suggest to you the evidence is clear this woman was obsessed with learning every ounce about that 6-week affair. She also testified that her mother tended to start the arguments. Also, she said her father, the alleged victim in this matter, Michael Ricci, was never, ever violent. With her mother, with anyone. So when you're trying to think about, I know Michael Ricci's not here to tell us about himself, think to all the people who knew him best. When you're trying to think about what kind of man this was, and by no means, ladies and gentlemen, do we condone an affair, or his behavior, or think that lots of drinking is okay. By no means is this a perfect individual. But you heard a lot more other things about it. In fact, you heard, and I'll go through the evidence, that upon the affair being revealed, that man, Michael Ricci, did everything possible. He did everything possible to save and salvage the family he loved so much. Everything. Angel Ricci testified too. Again, difficult. Difficult for these children, I call them children, they're adults, to have to come in here testifying about their mother when their father is no longer with them. What did he tell you? He was adopted by Michael Ricci in 2004, called him dad. After, had a happy childhood, after the fall of 2018, found out about the affair. He noticed changes in his mom. What were those changes? She was more secluded, she was angry, she yelled a lot. In fact, his quote was, and again, it's your memories, I govern, there was no getting away from it. The fights were ongoing. She was persistent about getting the truth. He explained that his father picked up the slack, and his quote was, tried to fix everything that was going on in the house. He explained that typically during fights between his parents, what would his father do again, trying to piece together what kind of man Michael Ricci was? He, I suggest to you, was the diffuser. She was the instigator, as the evidence showed. He diffused him. How do we know this? Everyone testified that lived in that home. What he would do during the argument, he would remove himself. He would walk outside and smoke a cigarette. What else did he testify to? that on Mother's Day of 2020, and he had trouble with dates, and I want to get to that, ladies and gentlemen, trouble with dates and confusing incidents. I ask you to think, when you're using your common sense, imagine for a moment, last year you witnessed 12 accidents. And then you were asked to come in and talk about every single detail of every single accident. Do you think you could do it? I mean, maybe. But compare that to one accident that you witnessed. Probably your memory would be a little bit easier to reconstruct about what you saw, what you heard, what you know. I suggest to you, this was repeated abuse at the hands of this woman to Michael Ricci. And lots of people saw it, and there were lots of different events. And because of that, I suggest to you, how disturbing is that? Her own kids can't keep track of all the times and all the different incidences that their mother hurt their father. So think about that for a minute when you're thinking about, well, I shouldn't believe him. I mean, he got confused a little bit with dates. Well, what he did say on redirect, as you might recall, is that on Mother's Day 2020, the same incident for corroborative purposes that Katrina testified to, that he referred to as mom poking himself with knife incident. He gets home, his parents were fighting about the affair, his mother was hysterical, there were things broken. He sees his mother grab a big Japanese-style knife and appears she was going to plunge it into herself. Angel, her son, calls for his father to go help, and the two of them are able to get that knife out of her hands and hide all the other knives. He said his father was, quote, trying to do what he did every day, just deal with it. He also indicated the defendant and the situation progressively got worse. Moving on, you heard from Officer Hunt and Officer Martin, two of the first, actually the two first police officers to respond to the scene on January 28, 2021. They both believed they were dispatched for a medical. Why is that important? Because that's what was told to them through Sophia, because the defendant failed to tell anyone what she had just done. Why? That's called consciousness of guilt. She's trying to hide what she had just done, because she knew what she had just done. Not sure how she thought she'd get away with them finding the stab wounds, but that's not for us to decide. Officer Hunt testified that the defendant was upset, distraught, difficult to understand. However, when Officer Kelly asked, only after they find the stab wound from the EMTs, Captain Smith testified to this, they ran in and said to the defendant, who stabbed him? Only then does she say, that's what I've been saying, he's bipolar and schizophrenic. Unfortunately, that is not what she was saying. And that's unfortunate for Michael Ricci. Because had she said she stabbed him, perhaps the help would have been quicker, or different, or the response would have been different altogether. She then indicates further detail to help herself, consciousness of guilt, and self-serving statements. She took a knife out of the kitchen drawer to defend herself. Again, she never says this until they find the stab wounds. I suggest she had plenty of time to manufacture a story that would help her during all the time it was taking for them trying to save Michael Ricci's life. And I suggest to you, all of these first responders have years of training. They all testify to it. They're used to traumatic events. You better believe that if any of those 4 men that testified under oath, or 5 men testified under oath, they did not hear her say anything about a stabbing, I suggest to you, you could believe that. Because had she said anything remotely sounding like, I stabbed him, or he came at me and I had to stab him, they would have responded differently. That's what their jobs are for, to respond and help. And know what? Their help is only as good as the information provided. And she failed miserably with that. Officer Martin also testified that the defendant told him conveniently, he had a manic episode and just collapsed. Again, self-serving statement. Tells them nothing about the situation so that they could help him appropriately. And no trouble understanding those statements, her self-serving statements. Only after confronted with the stab wounds, Officer Martin said it all kind of came together and they all realized that she had just stabbed him. Even if you believe her self-serving statements, that he had a manic episode or that he lunged at her, even if you believe that, ladies and gentlemen, which I suggest the evidence proves you should not believe that, but it's up to you. I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, how does that explain all of the other injuries? If he lunged at her, maybe that would explain the one wound. How do you claim self-defense, ladies and gentlemen, or that you had to be put in that situation when you also stabbed him in his back? She stabbed him in his back. She stabbed him in his heart. He never told anyone until they found those wounds. Robert Higgins testified, Bobby, from AA, you might recall. He testified that a few weeks before his friend Michael Ricci died, he saw him, and he saw him looking tired, gaunt. He looked like a man, I suggest to you, that suffered 2+ years of verbal and physical abuse at her hands. That's who he saw. I suggest to you he was fairly unrecognizable. And what does that corroborate with? Michael Jr.'s testimony about when he went to visit his father at the fire station. What else did he say? That's if you're questioning whether or not to believe her kids about all the broken things she used to have around the house. What did he take her shopping for? Mirrors. Lee Rivera testified from DCF, you might recall. Why is her testimony important? Again, looking for corroboration and why you should believe certain people's testimony versus others. She testified to the same event, I suggest to you, that Michael Jr. testified to, which was the June 6, 2019 incident where ultimately he described, and I'll get to it, Michael Jr., that his mother was going after his father with a knife, running towards the father, like this. And DCF becomes involved because Michael Jr. is so fed up, so tired, so upset by everything going on for the last 2+ years, or actually for the last year, because then he moves out, that he punches the wall. And then ultimately goes to the hospital after a friend tells him, you gotta go treat that, goes to the hospital and they file a 51A report. Lee Rivera does an investigation, and in the course of her investigation, she meets with the defendant, Christine Ricci. And why is that important? Well, Christine Ricci says, yet again, she and her husband were arguing about the affair, and her husband became upset because she continued to bring it up. Michael Jr. gets home and yells at them to stop. This is all her words to Lee Rivera. She then says, so I'm curious about, can I believe all the statements about Christine? In her own words, Christine says, I was in a fit of rage and grabbed a mirror in my bedroom and smashed it on the floor. She also denies any physical abuse. Interestingly enough, Christine Ricci is showing kind of a pattern here. She tells just a little bit, just like on January 28, 2021. She fails to tell the whole story, and the rest of the whole story is that she grabbed a knife and went after her husband on June 6, 2019. She stopped short of that. However, the important part is she was in a fit of rage. Her own words. Detective Davis testified, I won't get into too much detail, but he basically summarized everything that transpired from the moment that the police got involved all the way through to all the testing of the evidence that you have at your fingertips. You found out that through crime scene investigators and the state police that there were many things collected. You have Michael Ricci's shirts in evidence. I asked you to take a look at the holes in those shirts, ladies and gentlemen, signifying where Christine Ricci stabbed him. I suggest you also have the knives in evidence that have, for all intents and purposes, in layman's terms, you heard the lab technicians or crime scene talk about and DNA experts. Michael Ricci's blood's on those two knives. Those two knives are in evidence. One of those knives matches the very knife by the feet of Michael Ricci that you see a picture of. That's in evidence. His blood, not her blood, his blood. What else is important? Her shirt was taken into evidence. What is it to have on it? His blood. I suggest, you heard from Mark McDonald, Uncle Mac, we'll call him, who was a very close friend of the entire Ricci family. Yes, Michael Ricci was his best friend, he called him his brother. But he also was handpicked to be Sophia's godfather. That's how important he was to his family, how close he was to the family. And what did he tell you? He told you that he would go Thirsty Thursdays with Michael Ricci, and they'd go to the BBC in Pembroke. He also described to you that he actually saw scratches on Michael Ricci, a bleeding nose, fat lip, and he observed this all following the fall of 2018, which is when the affair was disclosed. He indicated that Michael Ricci stopped looking like the Mike he knew after the affair was revealed. He was more quiet, withdrawn. I suggest to you he looked like the battered man that he was. He also told you about two interesting events. Told you about the time that Christine Ricci and Michael Ricci surprised him at work, you might recall. And Christine Ricci did 90% of the talking, and it was supposedly for part of his AA treatment to make amends, which is interesting considering Michael spoke almost nothing. And how did he describe Michael? And again, getting to know Michael through the words of other people who are closest to him. Michael looked tired during this meeting, hunched over, only looking up at the very end. Not the same guy he knew and loved. And interestingly enough, that was an example of not just how Michael appeared during this, what I submit to you was an abusive relationship, but also how Christine appeared and the changes in her personality, which corroborates a lot of other witness testimony. Janine Bouchard, for example. Michael Jr., for example. And what he told you was that the defendant, Christine Ricci, not only did most of the talking, but was calm in the beginning, and then all of a sudden, something triggered her, I suggest, and she snapped and started screaming. This is at a place of business, to the point where he asked her to stop. Please be quiet. Help him to leave. He described it as night and day from when she first walked in the door. And he said, Michael Ricci never said a word while she was screaming. That was the last time he saw his best friend. And then thereafter, he could no longer contact him on the phone number. No longer worked. What else did he tell you? The incident about when the defendant was trying to find Janine. And what did he tell you about that? He got a call from Michael Ricci, and although he wasn't, you didn't hear any testimony about what that conversation entailed, he was worried and asked him to call her. So he called the defendant. Again, they had years and years of a relationship together. I suggest there was a lot of love between this whole family and Mac. And he called the defendant, and he said that the defendant said, I'm trying to find Janine. She was angry, then she became calm, then she started laughing, and then her tone changed, became angry. And then all of a sudden, she came upon mailboxes, which had Janine's last name, I suggest to you, as well as a Ricci, ironically. The Ricci name was on another mailbox right next door. And she began to become erratic, screaming, he said. He had to calm her down. He also described, ladies and gentlemen, that according to his observations, Michael Ricci was doing anything and everything to save his marriage. If that meant going to AA, that's what he would do. If that meant he stopped drinking, that's what he would do. Go to therapy? Sure. Anything. Anything. While he's doing anything and everything, she's berating him, hitting him, yelling at him, but he doesn't give up. Michael Dillon, the fire chief, testified. He testified that he knows Michael Ricci very well. Why? They work together. In April of 2017, Michael Ricci was asked and vetted to be his aide. You might recall I kind of described it kind of like a golf caddy. He kind of helped him with decisions, where to go, what to do. He was his right-hand man. And he discusses the criteria he used to pick an aide. Steady head, very responsible, well-liked, great at completing tasks. And what did he say? Michael Ricci exceeded the criteria. Why is that important, ladies and gentlemen? Well, defense has tried to elicit evidence and make you believe that Michael Ricci was this raging alcoholic. When? First of all, so remote from when this incident occurred that if the understanding is perhaps he was such a raging alcoholic that prompted the stabbing, that's nothing is in evidence about that. So we're talking about basically the same time that he was handpicked to be a fire chief's aide, he wants you, or he's arguing, that you should think that Michael Ricci was this raging alcoholic. I suggest to you, he testified that he saw no observations of anything remotely lending to that story. He also testified that he made certain observations that are important. 2019, 2 black eyes. His affect, Michael Ricci, somber. A few months before the January 28th incident, he came to work with 1 black eye. A week before, I suggest he was murdered, scratches on his neck. He also indicated that he had no concerns about anything that Michael Ricci was doing outside of work. With his memory, his drinking, nothing. Katrina Freeman. Why is she important, ladies and gentlemen? I suggest to you she has no skin in this game. The last contact she had with this family, first of all, it's not her family. She's no longer in the family. She's no longer dating Angel. It's been years. But she was privy to 4 years of what was going on in that house. 4 years. And I ask that you think back to her testimony. She moved in there 2017 into the Ricci household and lived there until 1 month before this defendant stabbed Michael Ricci. And during that time, she said initially in 2017, things were pretty great. Family dinners, they did a lot of laughing, watching movies. She was very close to Christine Ricci during the entire time, even when things were not good in the home. They still maintained a close relationship. In fact, when Christine Ricci discovered the affair, who did she reach out to? Katrina Freeman, and asked that she and Angel come see her. After that event, that prompted Katrina and Angel to go to that friend's house, where you might have remembered Christine Ricci seemed different. She was smoking, she doesn't usually smoke, and then she proceeded to tell them he had an affair, and we're done, basically, he's moving out. And then she said, but a few days later, everything changed. She said, actually, we're going to start to work on it. We're going to just work on this. It's going to work. She also testified that after that affair was revealed in the fall of 2018, the house was depressing, fighting constantly. The defendant, only the defendant, was always yelling, crying, and asking questions about the affair. She said that she actually talked about it at the end of 2018, where the defendant punched the victim in the face. Where the defendant punched the alleged victim in the face, Michael Ricci. And how do we know this? She didn't witness it, but she heard the fight, and then the defendant told her about it. I punched him in the face. And then she recalls her getting medical treatment for her hand. And she remembered the defendant screaming, I want answers. She needed details. It was fueling her. She needed to know more. She indicated to Katrina that the defendant stayed in her room most of the time. She was surprised that Michael Ricci went to AA because she never saw him abuse alcohol. I suggest to you, the defendant planted the seed of alcoholism. I mean, we're not saying the defendant, or Michael Ricci didn't drink, and maybe drank too much occasionally. But I suggest to you that the evidence has showed that she planted this idea in people's head because she needed some reason to understand why he could ever do these things. And she was embarrassed, I suggest. So that was the story that was going to be. He's an alcoholic, makes bad choices, and look at this. Because of alcohol, he cheated on me. She also stated that he stopped seeing friends. She never saw any issue with memory loss. And I asked her specifically, did you ever see injuries to Christine Ricci, other than when she punched him in the face? And she indicated, yes, actually. I would see cuts on her hands. And I said, did you know how those were caused? And she said, yeah, they were self-inflicted. Think about that for a moment, when you're looking at photographs. She also talked about the Mother's Day 2020 incident, again, corroborative of other people's testimony about the very same incident, where the defendant held a knife to her chest. Katrina got home. Mother's Day is hard. She had been drinking. She went inside and then ultimately went down and saw the defendant on the ground with a knife being held against her. And Angel and who? Michael Sr. were trying to help her, trying to get the knife away, a common theme. Trying to help the very woman that ultimately kills him, I suggest. Jadine Bouchard testified, the other woman. You don't need to like what happened, but I suggest to you, she shared enough of what her mindset was, and that was based on what Michael Ricci told her. And then the defendant adopted it, I suggest, by saying, he told me you guys were done. You weren't wearing your wedding bands, you were seeing someone else. He told me you guys were done. And she said, well, yeah, she agreed. And then at which point Janine said, this was during one of the many conversations, she said, well, then if that's the case, what, I know, like, I should have waited probably when you were divorced, but if you're saying all these things, what? I'm sorry, but I'm not sure it's kind of as bad as it's being made out to be, if you guys were done anyway. She also said, ladies and gentlemen, that their affair was brief, 6 weeks toward the end of the summer of 2018. And Columbus Day, Thursday of Columbus Day, she indicated there had been some sort of a plan. She believed that Michael Ricci was going to be sitting down with the family to let them know that he's no longer going to be with Christine Ricci. And then a couple of days later, surprisingly, she gets this random call from Michael Ricci doing a total about-face, saying, you never meant anything to me, in a monotone voice. You never meant anything to me. I love my wife. I never loved you. Big change. Totally understandable that he could change his mind or think differently or who knows. But that's what you heard under oath. She then indicated that after that conversation, she was done, I suggest. Their relationship was over. Yet, she kept getting calls. Missed calls from Michael Ricci's phone. And then on November 6, 2018, you have it as an exhibit, the defendant texted Janine. And I'm not going to go through it all, but basically just about how this woman has ruined her life, taken her man, it's her man, you could read that yourself. And then December 2019, just showing a pattern during the same time of aggression by the defendant. The defendant, unannounced, shows up at her house at night, knocked on the door, screaming, how could you do this to me? This is my husband, screaming and crying. And what did she say to her? I'm truly sorry. I thought you guys were done. Again, not wearing the rings. Thought you were seeing somebody. And what was her response, I asked? She agreed. All true. The defense said during that conversation that during any of the two conversations that she spoke to Michael Ricci when he was breaking up with her and ending things, that Christine Ricci was on the phone. So when we talk about controlling his phone, look no further. That's one example. She also indicated, Janine, that the defendant needed details, was demanding details. She was crying, angry, then calm, then yelling. She was all over the place on that event. Now fast forward to January 30th, 2020. More text from the defendant needing to talk to Janine. She needs to know about more dates, needs to know. And Janine said, no, I'm not going to do this. Now fast forward, March 18, 2020. That's the daughter event with Janine, where her daughter had to call the police because this woman wouldn't leave her home. The defendant comes, won't leave, and screaming the entire time, I need to talk to her, I need to talk to her. And Janine said, tell her I'm not talking to her. Look, this is the second time she's come to her house at night, unannounced, demanding answers, refusing to leave. Only leaves when the police get there. She described Michael Ricci as kind, sweet, calm. She actually never saw him drunk and never noticed any memory issues. You also heard, ladies and gentlemen, from Michael Ricci Jr. He described to you, ladies and gentlemen, what it was like living in that home. What did he tell you? The defendant, who he calls the defendant, constantly bringing up the affair. Do you love her? Are you going to start a family with her? Have you had sex with her? Never, ever, during any argument, did he testify that he ever heard his father screaming or yelling. Only his mother. He would, the defendant would keep asking Michael Ricci the same questions over and over again. And then in 2018 to 2019, he saw his father get punched in the face by his mother. Who does that corroborate? Katrina Freeman's testimony of the same event, where the defendant told her, yeah, I punched him in the face. He talked about how he would overhear his father say, stop hitting me. He would hear furniture breaking. House was shaking. He would come home from work and see shattered items all over. A golf club broken into, a glass door, a glass table, mirrors cracked. And then he talked about June 6, 2019, when he broke his hand, the knife incident. He indicated he was watching TV with the defendant, all was well. And then the defendant went upstairs. It's the middle of the day. He said his father comes home, asks, where's mom? Up the stairs. He goes up. At that point, the defendant, he hears them fighting, Michael Jr. He goes upstairs, the defendant grabs a mirror and throws it to the ground and yells, get out! And he sees his father say, all right, I'm out. And he walks out. And where does he go? Same place he always goes during the fight, to defuse the situation. Get away from her, let her calm down. He goes outside to smoke a cigarette. The very door that was so close to where this defendant killed him. He indicated that after his father left the room, he tried to calm his mother down, and then his mother got more and more angry, saying, you're siding with him, you're siding with him. She runs downstairs, he follows after her, she grabs a knife, and she holds it out. He described it with his hand, and I put it on the record in a right angle, I described. And he indicated from his body, and I suggest it's your memories that govern, running, he said she was running towards where my father just went out. Body forward, I suggest. What is that indicative of? Does that sound like somebody who's going to use a knife on herself? Perhaps her mindset shifted a little bit. When she knew she couldn't go after him, she then maybe wanted to use it on herself, which was a pattern. We don't know, but we can only find that out from the one eyewitness to that, and that's her own son, who told you exactly what he saw that day. And he was scared. And he was scared that she was going to hurt his own father, I suggest to you, and scared she was going to then hurt herself. What did he tell you? She was angry, hostile, incoherent, hysterical, at which point he yelled to his father, come in, grab all the knives. At that point, he said his mother then, he had to wrestle, put her arms behind her back. Finally, the knife was released from her hand. The situation appeared to be calm, and then his mother ran back up the stairs, where she had just smashed a mirror, and he was scared she was going to do something upstairs. So he followed her upstairs. At which point, he was so angry, so done, so upset about the years he's been watching this and hearing this happen, he punched a wall. What else did he tell you? The defendant would look through his father's phone, his father had changed his number, or did change his number, don't know why. His father was isolated from friends, including his best friend and godfather Matt. What else did he tell you? Family meetings. Not sure if you recall that line of testimony, but let me paint the picture that he testified to. He described it as one of the many, many times that the defendant would say, I need answers, I need more details, I need them, I need them, I need them. And then when she would find out a little bit more, she'd call everyone in. Her kids. His father would be sitting in a chair with the defense standing over him, sharing with them the new details she found out about their father. And she'd be screaming at their father. He also described, ladies and gentlemen, that the one-year trip at AA, it looked like he wasn't allowed to say a word in describing how his father appeared. He then described, ladies and gentlemen, that he visited his father for the very last time he saw him, 4 days before January 28th. And what did he describe? His father lost weight, had gray hairs, bags under his eyes, some bruising that he now recalls. They had a 3-hour talk. And what prompted this, ladies and gentlemen, was a call from Sophia, who I suggest did everything to try to paint a little bit, minimalize kind of what was happening in that house, and I understand that, I get it. But Sophia had called him to say, they're still fighting, they just keep fighting. At which point, Junior took matters into his own hand, went to the firehouse, who had the text message, saying, I'm here, can I stop by? And proceeded to talk to his father for 3 hours, man to man, saying, stand up for yourself, you're not happy. Show courage to Sophia and Angel. And what was the father doing? Not much talking, but a lot of crying. Imagine, his son was kind of bothering him. And then it ended with a hug, I love you. He described that his father was 0. He described that his father, he observed no issues with memory or with alcohol. He was only told these things by his mother. And he then ended by talking about why defense counsel asked, well, you resented him, or you resented her because she kept bringing up the affair. Like, maybe that's why you're testifying this way. I think it's the insinuation. And he said, well, yeah, she brought up the affair every day. She also was aggressive, physical, and violent. Dr. Martinez was the tail end of all the witnesses that he sat through. I need not remind you, but she described that Michael Ricci Sr. was 5'10". So even though Angel testified 6'4", he was 5'10". That was what the doctor said. She measured him. It's in his chart. And she described that she examined Michael Ricci's body. He had a stab wound in his heart that was 3 centimeters in length, about 15 centimeters in depth. Through the probe, they realized this. And that wound path went through subcutaneous soft tissue, piercing through his rib cartilage, his pericardium, piercing his heart in multiple places, and causing an accumulation of blood around his heart and a collapsed lung. That's just one wound. Then, turned him over, where the defendant had stabbed him in the back left shoulder, and described that as a 3.1 centimeter in length by 6.6 centimeter depth through soft tissue and muscles of the back. Then she described a third wound, an incised wound to his back, and then fresh abrasions wounds to his hands. That's what Dr. Martinez said, and she confirmed that, not that it's any surprise, he died from the stab wound to his heart. That was the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, as I recall it. Again, your memories govern. So if I'm wrong about a detail, it's your memories. And you heard a lot about other acts, and the judge will instruct you on it as she's done throughout the trial. But I suggest to you, the Commonwealth is not trying to distract you with the bad acts. You need to know about the pattern of conduct and the level of hostility that this woman had for her husband. You deserve to know about that, because else you're not knowing the full picture. It would seem isolated. You also, ladies and gentlemen, these other injuries, these other acts, it also can be used to negate any claim of accident or self-defense. And again, you'll hear all of this in the judge's instructions, I suggest. But the fact of the matter is, had you not had the benefit of hearing about all the other abusive behavior at her hands, perhaps you might maybe give a little bit of credence to the defense counsel's closing argument, 15 minutes of pure, unadulterated speculation, not based on evidence. But you have the benefit from so many people hearing and telling you about so many injuries, black eyes, scratches, bloody nose, bloody lip. This went on for 2+ years. Michael Ricci became Christine Ricci's human punching bag. She took out her anger, aggression, embarrassment, jealousy, and rage on the man that she supposedly loved so much that had cheated on her for 6 weeks. Defense counsel, ladies and gentlemen, argued a little bit about heat of passion, and you're going to be instructed on it. There's something called heat of passion on reasonable provocation. You're going to be instructed on it. I suggest to you that you would need to find that this defendant was provoked by Michael Ricci. And how do we know she wasn't? Look to the past. There's not one piece of evidence to suggest to you that on this day or any other day that he provoked anything. He was the diffuser, the calm one, the one who removed himself from situations, the one who wrestled knives at his wife's hands so she wouldn't hurt herself. That's who Michael Ricci was. So there was no heat of passion due to reasonable provocation. It was the same old, same old. She wanted to erase the past, but in doing so needed answers. And when not getting answers, she couldn't handle it anymore. There was also no mental impairment on behalf of the defendant. The only evidence you heard was that she would have panic attacks. And yes, did she try to kill herself before? Sure. There's no evidence that on this particular day she was in the midst of having a panic attack when this happened, or in the midst of feeling like some sort of craziness was going on. All you know is that they were arguing, there was banging, and then she stabbed him 2 times. And the only evidence of any maybe mental impairment is afterwards. After she knew she had just killed her husband, I suggest to you, she has a panic attack. I suggest I might have one too. If I had just pierced a knife into my husband's heart. As stated in the opening, ladies and gentlemen, by my sister here, Christine Ricci was like a simmering pot of anger, jealousy, rage, and control that boiled over on January 28, 2021. She spent 2 years doing everything in her control and power to control and isolate Michael Ricci. Yet she managed to lose all self-control in doing so. And ultimately, she picked up a knife, just like she had done on other occasions, showing that pattern, and killed her husband, Michael Ricci. That's why we're here. It's not a pile of dirt, ladies and gentlemen. It's their lives. Find guilty.
Chelsea Council consent to bench.
With the jury and the defendant remain standing, all others be seated, please.
May I inquire, Your Honor?
You may.
Members of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Officer, can you please send the verdict slips? What say you, Madam Forelady, as to indictment number 2183CR00153 on offense number 001, wherein the defendant, Christine Ricci, is charged with the crime of murder? Is she guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Guilty of what?
Murder in the 2nd degree.
Thank you. As to offense number 002, wherein the defendant, Christine Ricci, is charged with the crime of assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. Is she guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Your Honor, the verdict be affirmed.
Yes, I may.
Thank you. Members of the jury, hearken to your verdict as the court has so recorded it. You, upon your oath, do say that the defendant, Christine Ricci, is guilty of murder in the 2nd degree on indictment number 2183CR00153, offense number 001. So say you, Madam Forelady.
Guilty.
So say you, all members of the jury.
Guilty.
You further, upon your oath, do say that the defendant, Christine Ricci, is guilty on indictment number 2183CR00153 on offense number 002 on the charge of assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. So say you, Madam Forelady.
Guilty.
So say you, all members of the jury.
Guilty.
Thank you. Your Honor, the verdict has been recorded and affirmed.
Charge